Well, we're living in some difficult times at the moment with this war in Ukraine. And after I made my second documentary about the Olivet Discourse, it does bring up the questions: what is our response to war? And so I want us to think about that today. And I want us to talk about Mark's gospel. I want us to think about that Mark is presenting an anti war theme in his gospel. And I wrote an essay about this recently. And so this stuff is sort of fresh in my mind. First of all, many say that Mark is the first gospel, and they date it to the mid 60s. Let me suggest to you a couple of reasons why Mark's gospel could have been written in the 60s. One is that it could have been written during Nero's persecution, which took place in the 60s. Another one is the tradition that Peter was the source of information. Now, Peter died in the mid 60s, we think, so the gospel would have had to have been written before that. Another reason is that Matthew seems to be writing to a Jewish community, and it seems like they were a Jewish community that were broken off from the other communities, which of course that would have been a result of AD 70 and a result of the war, which would have pushed Matthew's gospel into the 70s, but Mark may still be preserved into the 60s. But I do think the main reason we can sort of see that Mark is written in the 60s is because the gospel would have taken place during the Roman Jewish War, and it would have taken place in the 60s, probably before the destruction of the temple in AD 70. So let me run through a couple of details to show how we could see if that is the case. W.R. Telford, in his commentary on Mark, notes that in Mark 3:6 it speaks about an alliance between the Herodians and the Pharisees. And he says that at the time of Jesus, this was viewed very much as suspicion. The only sort of historical alliance between these two groups that we know of actually occurred between 66 to 67 AD, when the Pharisees wanted to prevent Holocaust when Rome joined Herod Agrippa II. Now, one of the main chapters to promote an anti-war theme is, of course, Mark 13, the Olivet Discourse, which is what the movie was about. Now, Ched Myers, who I interviewed in the film and who I've drawn on a lot in the essay, he dates Mark to around 69, and he says that in the Little Apocalypse, it was written during a time when the Jewish rebels wanted to force Rome out with force, but then Jesus is actually warning his disciples in Mark 13 not to seize the temptation to join the rebels' patriot call to arms, and that Jesus is actually wanting to protect them by saying, "Flee to the mountains when you see the army surrounding Jerusalem." It's to reject the claims of the rebel recruiters. So it would have been the case that Mark's community, who he was writing to, would have already been persuaded by the Jewish rebels. They also would have been persuaded by the Roman Empire. But the genius of Jesus' words is that he tells them not to do both, but to stay right in the middle. Now, Ched Myers claims that when Jesus talks about beware of those who will lead you astray and false prophets in Mark 13, he's not actually worried about those who can heal and exercise in the messianic name and lead people astray, but actually he links them to the rebel recruiters. So Myers connects Jesus' words: "When you hear of wars and rumors of wars, do not be alarmed." Something else that Myers draws on is also this use of Jesus saying, "Watch and stay awake and stay alert," which is also seen in the Pauline letters. He says that you will be flogged over to local councils, family will betray you. And he's basically saying that it's to sort of watch and endure the persecution rather than take the easy route, than to turn to violence and join the rebels or to take allegiance with Rome. So it seems that Jesus' way in the midst of these two temptations is sort of sat nicely in the middle there, not confining to one or the other. So basically, Mark is collecting all these stories, and he's basically wanted to use them to remind the reader not to give in to the temptation to join the war, basically. That's the reason, or one of the reasons, why Mark's Gospel is compiled in this way. So we need to remember that when reading the Gospels, we have the story at face value of Jesus, but underneath there is this subtext, and I want to suggest that the subtext, or at least one of them for Mark, is this anti-war approach. Now, another story that is key is actually the story of Jesus and Peter in the Garden of Gethsemane, because once again Jesus says, "Stay here and keep watch." And if you think that in chapter 13 he tells them to keep watch, now we see in chapter 14 they were not able to keep watch, because immediately after that we see that one of the disciples cut off the ear of the high priest's servant. It's not mentioned by name in Mark, but in John's gospel we find out it's Peter actually who did that. Matthew in his account takes it further, because Jesus says, "Put your sword back in its place. For all who take the sword will perish by the sword." Luke also expands these words in the Last Supper when he says, when the disciples say to him, "Look, here are two swords," and he replied, "It is enough." Or some translations say, "That is enough." You do get the impression that Jesus was completely against violence. So the Garden of Gethsemane story, Mark is using the Peter as an example of, don't go down this road. Don't take that easy temptation like Peter did. Hold on to Jesus' words of watch and wait and endure the persecution, but know that God will protect you and strengthen you through that time. In terms of a hermeneutic approach, something that is helpful is what's known as redaction criticism, and that's basically a way of looking at why the author has selected certain stories and arranged them in a certain way. Because we know the Gospels are slightly different. The other writers wanted to present the stories in a different order in order to convey a certain message. Another pattern that we see, or another story, would be the story of John the Baptist. We see he's a faithful follower of Jesus, and basically the message there, if you're going to follow Jesus, trouble may come ahead, and we know that John the Baptist was beheaded. So again, Mark is using that story to remind the followers that trouble may come if you follow Jesus, which would then emphasize later Mark's use of Jesus' words, "They must take up their cross and follow me." Taking up the cross means that you will suffer for your faith. But again, Mark is wanting to comfort his audience as they live in the midst of this war. Another technique that Mark uses is what scholars call the Markan secret. It's basically those moments when someone finds out something about Jesus, his true identity, who he really is, and then he tells them strictly not to tell anyone just yet. And we wonder, oh, why on earth would Jesus do that? But David Pawson, actually, another writer, suggests that this story is presenting Jesus as this kind of messianic secret, this secret Messiah. Because we need to remember people had different expectations of the Messiah at that time. The expectations of the Messiah was actually what the Jewish rebels were sort of advocating, one who would call up the patriot call to arms and overthrow the Roman Empire, which is exactly what Mark is telling them not to get involved with. So Pawson says that Jesus almost wanted to keep his identity hidden because there was a demand that he would become a political Messiah, which would hinder his ministry and could conceivably prevent his death. We need to remember that Mark's gospel is leading all the way up to Jesus' death. We can see this many times when when Peter says to him, "This will never happen to you," and then Jesus rebukes him. The Messiah is one who suffers for his people, not one who brings victory by bloodshed and violence. Mark is wanting to promote very much an anti-violent and an anti-war approach in his gospel. All right, another story that Mark uses to convey this sort of following Jesus means there will be hard times is the story and the fate, rather, of James and John, the son of Zebedee, two of the followers, when Jesus says that they will drink the cup and be baptized with the baptism Jesus were baptized with in Mark 10:39. All of these patterns point to a Messiah who would suffer and die, rather than one who delivers his people from the hands of his enemies during wartime, which again, remember, Mark's audience would have been living during wartime. Right, another interesting story is the story of Jesus and Barabbas, which does emphasize, I think, an anti-war hermeneutic. In Mark 15, we have the contrast here of two criminals. One just so happened to be a rebel, funny enough, and that is the connection in verse 7 that Barabbas was a rebel who had committed murder along with the insurrectionists in one of the uprising. Luke's gospel actually tells us that he committed murder in a rebellion. So we know that we know that rebellions were taking place at the time of Jesus. Obviously, they intensified during the time of the 60s. But Mark deliberately would have been using this story to bring it to home to people. Okay, here it is, right in front of you. Who are you going to choose? Jesus and his way, the non-violent way, or Barabbas, which emphasizes the Jewish rebel way using violence. He is sort of presenting these two men in contrast to one another. Who are you going to choose? It speaks to our world. Who are we going to choose? Eugene Borin, in his commentaries on Mark, says that during the whole period from the Roman takeover of Palestine to 63 to the revolt in 66, only people crucified in Palestine were those convicted of being revolutionaries and their followers. It's important for Mark and his readers to distinguish Jesus from the revolutionaries, such as Barabbas. The point will again be made at the cross, where those who were crucified are actually revolutionaries. Dr. Helen Bond, who I interviewed in the previous video, also comments on the Barabbas story. She says that in that story, Jesus is described as the king of the Jews, and for the crowd, the question is, who is their true king? Now, Bond does date Mark at 71, not in the 60s, which I've been advocating, but nevertheless, she does recognize that there is a choice in these two characters. And she maintains that the readers for Mark, this narrative would have spoken to them about the Jewish war from 66 to 70. Alright, so we've looked at a couple of stories there that may promote an anti-war hermeneutic from Mark's Gospel. Now, in the next video, I want us to think about our modern day, really, and our response to war, because we see in the UK, Ukraine and Russia that this does make us engage with this topic, and we need to think of what our response is. I know where we live in the world, people may give different answers, but see what you think of this video, and I hope this has got you thinking. Please subscribe to my channel, because I'll be releasing new videos like this, hopefully on a daily basis. But thanks a lot.